When I heard the rumble of military vehicles pulling into our quiet suburban cul-de-sac at 7 in the morning, I thought there had been some mistake. When I saw my brother Marcus step out of the lead Humvee in full dress blues, flanked by 5 other Marines, I knew my family was about to learn exactly what happens when you abandon one of your own. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 months earlier, I never would have imagined I'd be standing in a courtroom, trembling as a judge read domestic violence charges against my husband of 8 years. Derek Hoffman had always been charming in public, the kind of man who coached Little League on weekends and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. Behind closed doors, our marriage was a carefully orchestrated nightmare that I'd become an expert at hiding. The bruises were always in places my clothes would cover. The verbal attacks always happened when the kids were asleep or at school. Derek was methodical in his cruelty, smart enough to never leave evidence that would raise questions from outsiders. For 3 years, I convinced myself I could manage it, that I could protect our 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler, from witnessing the worst of it. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in February. Derek had been drinking since he got home from his job at the construction company, angry about a client who'd complained about his work. When Tyler accidentally spilled juice on Derek's laptop, the explosion that followed was unlike anything I'd seen before. Derek didn't just yell. He grabbed Tyler by the shoulders and shook him so hard, I heard the little boy's teeth chatter. That's when I stepped in. That's when Derek's fist connected with my jaw hard enough to send me crashing into the kitchen island. Emma started screaming. Tyler was crying. And for the first time in 3 years, I couldn't hide what was happening in our house. Mrs. Patterson from next door called the police after she heard the commotion through our shared wall. When the officers arrived, Derek had already coached the kids on what to say, his arm around my shoulders in a mockery of concern, as he explained that I'd had a little accident in the kitchen. But Emma, brave little Emma, looked right at Officer Rodriguez and said, "Daddy hurt Mommy and Tyler." Quote, the next 48 hours were a blur of police statements, photographs of my injuries, and emergency protective orders. Derek was arrested and released on bail with a no-contact order. Suddenly, I found myself alone with 2 traumatized children, no income since Derek controlled all our finances, and a mortgage I couldn't afford on my part-time bookkeeping salary. That's when I reached out to my family. I called my parents first, my hands shaking as I dialed their number in Phoenix. My mother, Patricia Caldwell, listened to my explanation with the kind of silence that felt like judgment. When I finished, she sighed deeply and said, "Honey, marriage is hard work. Have you considered counseling? I'm sure Derek didn't mean." "Mom," he grabbed Tyler. He shook him like a rag doll. "Children can be dramatic, sweetie, and you know how you sometimes exaggerate when you're upset." My father got on the phone next. William Caldwell had always been a practical man, the kind who believed problems could be solved with hard work and determination. "Sarah, I'm not going to lie to you. This sounds like a mess of your own making. You married him, you had kids with him. Now you want to break up the family over what sounds like a heated argument that got out of hand? Dad, there are police reports, photographs. Police get called to domestic disputes all the time. Doesn't mean anyone needs to go to prison over it." When I mentioned needing financial help to keep the house while the legal proceedings played out, the conversation grew even colder. My parents had money. Dad's successful accounting firm had afforded them a comfortable retirement, but they made it clear that supporting what they saw as my rash decision to leave Derek wasn't something they were willing to do. I tried my older sister Michelle next. She lived in Seattle with her investment banker husband and their twin daughters. Michelle had always been the golden child, the one who made perfect choices and lived a perfect life. When I explained the situation, she was sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. "Oh, Sarah, that sounds terrible. But honestly, we just took on a huge mortgage for the new house, and the girls' private school tuition is astronomical. I wish I could help, but our finances are stretched thin right now." I knew for a fact that Michelle and her husband had just returned from a 3-week vacation in Europe. Her social media was full of photos from their stay at luxury resorts. But I swallowed my pride and asked anyway. "Michelle, I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay back every penny. I just need enough to cover rent for a few months, while I find full-time work. You know how Gary feels about lending money to family. it changes relationships. My brother James in Denver was next. As a successful software engineer, he'd always been generous with advice, but cautious with everything else. His response was perhaps the most painful because it came wrapped in genuine concern. "Sarah, I believe you about Derek. I never liked him. But getting involved in a domestic violence case, that's complicated. What if Derek tries to retaliate against anyone who helps you? I have to think about my own family's safety." When I pressed him about temporary financial assistance, he hedged. "Look, I'd love to help, but I'm not sure enabling you to stay in that town is the right move. Maybe you should consider moving back to Phoenix, closer to mom and dad. They could help with the kids while you get back on your feet." "James, Derek lives in this town. The restraining order is only valid if I stay here where it was issued. If I move, I lose that legal protection." "That sounds like something you should discuss with a lawyer. I just don't think I'm the right person to help with this situation." The rejections kept coming. My Aunt Carol in Nashville claimed she was dealing with her own financial struggles after her husband's retirement. My cousin David in Chicago said he'd love to help, but was in the middle of his own divorce and couldn't take on additional responsibilities. Even my grandmother, who'd always doted on Emma and Tyler, seemed more concerned about the family's reputation than our safety. "What will people think?" she asked during our phone call. "The Caldwells have never had this kind of trouble. Maybe you should work things out with Derek quietly." Men can change if you give them the right motivation. Within 2 weeks, I realized I was completely on my own. The protective order was holding. Derek hadn't tried to contact us directly, but his friends and family had made it clear they considered me the villain in this story. Derek's mother called me a manipulative liar in the grocery store. His brother sent threatening text messages that I had to report to the police. The construction company where Derek worked started spreading rumors that I was unstable, which cost me several bookkeeping clients who didn't want to be associated with quote, drama. Quote, "The financial pressure was crushing. Between legal fees, childcare costs, and basic living expenses, my savings evaporated within a month. I applied for every form of assistance available, but the bureaucracy moved slowly while bills arrived with clockwork precision. I took on extra bookkeeping work, sometimes staying up until 3 a.m. to complete projects while the kids slept. Emma started having nightmares. Tyler began wetting the bed again. They both asked constantly when Daddy was coming home, not understanding why everything in their world had suddenly changed. I tried to explain in age-appropriate terms, but how do you tell a 6-year-old that their father is dangerous without destroying their sense of security entirely? The breaking point came 6 weeks after Derek's arrest. I was working late on a particularly complex set of books for a small restaurant when I heard a noise outside. Through the living room window, I saw Derek's truck parked across the street. He was just sitting there, engine running, staring at our house. I called the police immediately. By the time they arrived 20 minutes later, Derek was gone. The officers took a report and promised to increase patrols in our neighborhood, but I could see in their eyes that they'd dealt with this scenario countless times before. Restraining orders were just pieces of paper. They couldn't stop someone who was determined to cause harm. That night, I called every family member again. I was no longer asking for money or long-term support. I was begging for a safe place for my children to stay while I figured out our next steps. I offered to work for anyone who would take us in, to clean houses or watch children or do bookkeeping for free in exchange for temporary shelter. The responses were variations on the same theme. "We wish we could help, but it's not a good time. Maybe you should reconsider." My mother's final response summed up the family's position. "Sarah, you made this bed when you decided to destroy your marriage over what amounts to a marital spat. We love you, but we can't enable this destructive behavior. Derek's a good man who made a mistake. If you just swallow your pride and work things out, none of this would be necessary." That's when I realized I had one option left. My youngest brother Marcus had been deployed with the Marines for the past year. We'd exchanged a few emails, but communication was sporadic due to operational security requirements. I wasn't even sure if he knew about my situation with Derek. I wrote him a letter explaining everything: the abuse, the arrest, the family's rejection, the financial desperation, and Derek's violation of the restraining order. I sent it through the military postal system. with no real expectation of a response. Marcus was thousands of miles away, serving his country. What could he possibly do to help? I never imagined that letter would set in motion events that would change everything for my family and teach the Caldwells exactly what loyalty actually means. Marcus received my letter 3 weeks later at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. What I didn't know was that my baby brother, the same kid who used to build elaborate Lego fortresses and cry during sad movies, had become Staff Sergeant Marcus Caldwell, a decorated Marine with 2 tours under his belt and the respect of every man in his unit. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Marcus read my letter in the communications tent after a 14-hour patrol through hostile territory. Sergeant First Class Antonio Reeves, his closest friend and fellow squad leader, found him there an hour later, still holding the pages with white knuckles. "Bad news from home?" Tony asked, settling down beside Marcus on the bench. Marcus handed him the letter without a word. Tony read it twice, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked at Marcus and said, "Your family's got their heads screwed on backwards, brother." "My sister's got 2 babies, and nowhere safe to go," Marcus said quietly, "and every single person who's supposed to care about her has turned their backs." What happened next was something I wouldn't learn about until much later. Marcus didn't just write me back. He called an unofficial meeting with his entire squad. Corporal Jake Morrison, Lance Corporal David Chen, Private First Class Miguel Santos, and Sergeant Reeves gathered in the makeshift rec area they'd built behind their barracks. Marcus told them everything, not just about Derek's abuse or my family's abandonment, but about who I was as a person. How I'd sent him care packages every month of his deployment, filled with homemade cookies and letters full of encouragement. How I'd been the only family member to support his decision to enlist when everyone else called it a mistake. How I'd driven 8 hours to attend his graduation from boot camp, when our parents claimed they were too busy. "She's got more backbone than the rest of our family combined," Marcus told his squad that night. "And she's drowning while they sit in their comfortable houses pretending it's not their problem." The response from his Marines was immediate and unanimous. These weren't just soldiers. They were brothers who'd saved each other's lives in firefights, who'd shared their last rations during supply delays, who'd held each other together through the darkest moments of war. The concept of abandoning a family in crisis was foreign to everything they believed in. Corporal Morrison spoke first. "Sarge, when my mom got sick last year, you guys helped me send money home every month. Didn't even have to ask." Lance Corporal Chen nodded. "My little brother was getting bullied at school. Remember what you told me? Marines protect their own, and family is Marines. Your sister is our family now." They spent the next 2 hours planning. Not just emotional support or encouraging words, but concrete action. Between the 5 of them, they had almost 4 months of combat pay saved up. They'd been planning to spend it on leave activities when they rotated home, but unanimously voted to send it to me instead. More importantly, they began planning for what would happen when their deployment ended in 6 weeks. Marcus wrote me back immediately, but his letter was unlike anything I'd ever received from my quiet, thoughtful baby brother. There was steel in his words, authority that came from leading men in life-or-death situations. "Sarah," he wrote, "you are not alone. You never were. I'm sorry I was halfway around the world when this started, but that ends now. You're going to receive money in the next few days, enough to keep you and the kids safe and fed until I get home. Do not refuse it. Do not feel guilty about it. Family takes care of family, and these Marines are your family now whether you've met them or not. As for Derek and his threats, document everything. Every violation, every sighting, every time someone affiliated with him tries to intimidate you. When I get home, we're going to deal with this situation permanently and legally. And as for our parents and siblings, they're about to learn what happens when Marines find out you've abandoned one of our own." The money transfer arrived 3 days later, $8,000 from 5 Marines who'd never met me but considered me worth protecting. With it came individual letters from each squad member. Tony Reeves wrote about growing up with an abusive stepfather and promised that Emma and Tyler would never have to be afraid again. Jake Morrison shared that his sister had been in a similar situation and he wished someone had helped her the way they were helping me. David Chen told me about the Marine Corps principle that you never leave anyone behind, in war or in peace. Miguel Santos, barely 19 years old, sent pictures of his own nieces and said he couldn't imagine anyone hurting children or the mothers who protected them. For the first time in months, I cried tears of relief instead of desperation. The money allowed me to catch up on bills, secure better legal representation, and even move to a safer apartment across town. My new lawyer, Rebecca Martinez, was a former prosecutor who specialized in domestic violence cases. She reviewed Derek's history and the violations of his restraining order with the kind of cold efficiency that gave me hope for the first time since this nightmare began. Your husband is escalating, she told me during our first meeting. The violations are getting bolder, more frequent. That's actually good news for our case, because it establishes a pattern of harassment that the court can't ignore. She was right. Derek's behavior had become increasingly erratic since I'd moved apartments. He'd been spotted outside Emma's school twice, forcing me to arrange for a teacher to walk her to my car each day. He'd called my new bookkeeping clients, claiming I was unstable and would steal from them. His mother had shown up at Tyler's daycare, demanding to see her grandson and causing such a scene that the director had to call security. Each incident went into Rebecca's growing file. Each police report built our case stronger. Derek was digging his own legal grave, but that didn't make the daily reality any less terrifying. Meanwhile, Marcus and his squad were preparing for their return to the United States. Their commanding officer, Captain Williams, had noticed the unusual focus and intensity among his most reliable Marines, and asked Marcus about it privately. When Marcus explained the situation, Captain Williams made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. He accelerated the squad's rotation schedule, citing their exemplary service record and earned early return. More importantly, he made arrangements for their first leave to be spent in my town, officially for family support and community outreach. The Marines were coming home 3 weeks early, and they had plans. During those final weeks of deployment, Marcus stayed in constant communication with Rebecca Martinez. She'd agreed to represent me pro bono after Marcus explained his squad's situation and their commitment to ensuring my safety. Rebecca had worked with military families before and understood the unique resources and determination that Marines brought to protecting their own. She coordinated with local police to document Derek's escalating violations, built a comprehensive case for extending the restraining order, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation that would occur when Derek realized I had serious backing. What none of us anticipated was how quickly the news of Marcus's involvement would spread through our family network. My mother called me for the first time in weeks, her voice tight with worry. "Sarah, I just heard from James that Marcus is coming home early. He's not planning to do anything rash, is he? Violence never solves anything." "Mom, Derek has been stalking me and the kids for 2 months. He violated his restraining order 6 times. Marcus is coming home to support his sister, something the rest of his family should have done from the beginning." "Don't be dramatic, honey, and don't let Marcus get involved in something that could hurt his military career. You know how important that is to him." The irony was staggering. After months of rejecting my pleas for help, my family was suddenly concerned, not about my safety or my children's welfare, but about potential embarrassment if Marcus took action they couldn't control. Michelle called next, her voice carrying that particular blend of condescension and panic that I'd learned to recognize. "Sarah, Gary thinks you should consider dropping the charges against Derek. This whole situation is getting out of hand. What if Marcus does something that reflects badly on all of us?" "Michelle," Derek grabbed Tyler and punched me in the face. "There are photographs, police reports. What exactly should I be reconsidering?" "You know what I mean. This whole military intervention thing looks excessive. People are going to think we couldn't handle our own family problems." That's when I understood the real issue. My family wasn't worried about Derek's violence or my children's safety. They were worried about appearances, about having to explain to their friends and neighbors why Marines were getting involved in what they still saw as a private family matter. James was more direct in his concern. "Sarah, I just want you to know that whatever Marcus is planning, the rest of us had nothing to do with it. We can't be held responsible for his actions." No one's asking you to be responsible for anything, James. You've all made it clear you don't want to be involved. That's not fair. We just don't think military intimidation is the right approach. Military intimidation? I repeated. James, my brother and his friends are coming home from Afghanistan, where they've been fighting actual terrorists. They're taking leave time to make sure Derek understands that I'm not alone and defenseless. That's not intimidation. That's protection. As word spread through our extended family network, the reactions became increasingly defensive. People who hadn't spoken to me in months were suddenly calling to express concern about the situation, escalating unnecessarily. The same relatives who'd ignored my pleas for help were now worried about the optics of Marines getting involved in a domestic dispute. What they didn't understand was that Marcus and his squad weren't planning intimidation or violence. They were planning something much more effective: accountability. In 5 days, Staff Sergeant Marcus Caldwell and his Marines would be home. And everyone who had abandoned his sister was about to discover what it meant to face a squad of combat veterans who took the phrase "leave no one behind" as sacred doctrine. The Marines landed at Denver International Airport on a Tuesday morning in early June. Marcus had coordinated their arrival to coincide with a 3-day weekend, giving them maximum time to address what they'd privately begun calling Operation Family Shield. What struck me most when I picked up Marcus at the smaller regional airport was how much he'd changed in 18 months of deployment. This wasn't the gentle 22-year-old who'd left for Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Caldwell carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd made life-or-death decisions under pressure. His handshake was firm, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings, and when he hugged me and the kids, there was a protective intensity that made me feel safer than I had in months. Emma and Tyler were initially shy around their uncle they barely remembered, but Marcus had clearly learned patience and gentleness during his deployment. He spent the drive to my apartment asking them about school, their friends, and their favorite movies, gradually drawing them out of their shells. By the time we reached home, Tyler was showing Marcus his collection of toy soldiers, and Emma was explaining her art projects with the enthusiasm she'd lost during the worst weeks with Derek. "Where are we meeting the others?" I asked as Marcus surveyed my new apartment, automatically noting the secure locks I'd installed and the clear sightlines from the windows. "They're getting settled at the base hotel tonight. Tomorrow morning we start with Derek." I felt a chill of apprehension. "Marcus, what exactly are you planning? I don't want you to get in trouble or..." He held up a hand, and I saw the same gesture I'd watched him use to quiet unruly recruits in videos he'd sent from basic training. "Sarah, we're not going to break any laws, we're not going to threaten anyone, we're going to have conversations. Very clear, very direct conversations with everyone who needs to understand the new reality." "What new reality?" Marcus smiled, and for a moment I glimpsed the little brother I remembered. That you're not alone anymore, that Emma and Tyler have protection, and that there are consequences for the choices people have made. The next morning, Derek Hoffman got the first demonstration of this new reality. He was leaving his apartment complex for work when he found 5 Marines in dress blues standing beside his truck. Marcus stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his presence unmistakably commanding. "Derek Hoffman? I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Caldwell, Sarah's brother. We need to talk." According to the police report filed later, Derek's first instinct was to puff himself up and try to intimidate Marcus. At 6'2" and 200 pounds of construction worker muscle, Derek was used to using his physical presence to control situations. He stepped closer to Marcus, attempting to loom over him. "I don't have to talk to you about anything, soldier boy. This is between me and my wife." Marcus didn't move, didn't step back, didn't rise to the bait, didn't show any reaction at all. Behind him, Tony Reeves, Jake Morrison, David Chen, and Miguel Santos remained perfectly still, their silence more menacing than any threat could have been. "Mr. Hoffman," Marcus said in the same calm tone he'd used to brief commanders during combat operations, "you seem to be confused about several facts. First, Sarah is your ex-wife. The divorce papers were filed last week. Second, you've violated your restraining order 6 times in the past month. Third, you've been photographed stalking my niece and nephew. Fourth, Your mother created a disturbance at Tyler's daycare that required security intervention. Derek's face was turning red, but something in Marcus's demeanor was preventing him from escalating to physical confrontation. These weren't college kids he could bully, or neighbors he could intimidate. These were combat veterans who'd faced down actual enemies in actual war zones. "What do you want?" Derek finally asked. "I want you to understand your new situation," Marcus replied. "My squad and I are on leave for the next month. We'll be staying in town, helping Sarah and the kids get settled into their new life. During that time, we'll be keeping a close eye on things." He gestured to Jake Morrison, who stepped forward with a manila folder. "Corporal Morrison here has compiled a comprehensive file of every law you've broken in the past 2 months. Every violation of your restraining order, every act of stalking, every attempt at intimidation. It's been delivered to the district attorney's office with a formal request for immediate prosecution." Derek snatched the folder and flipped through it, his face going pale as he saw the detailed documentation, photographs, and witness statements. "You can't prove half of this," he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Lance Corporal Chen stepped forward next. "Actually, we can. I spent 3 years in military intelligence before infantry. Documentation is a specialty of mine. Page 12 shows the GPS data from your truck, placing you outside Emma's school during prohibited hours. Page 18 has testimony from 4 witnesses who saw you approach Tyler's daycare. Page 23 contains recorded statements from your drinking buddies, admitting you asked them to drive by Sarah's apartment to check on things." Derek was looking increasingly trapped, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Here's what happens next," Marcus continued. "You're going to accept the divorce terms Sarah's lawyer proposed. You're going to stay away from her, the kids, their schools, their activities, and anywhere else they might be. You're going to tell your family and friends to do the same. And you're going to find a new town to rebuild your life, because this one is no longer safe for you." "You can't make me leave town," Derek said, but his voice cracked slightly. Sergeant Reeves spoke for the first time, his Brooklyn accent thick with controlled anger. "Son, we just spent 18 months fighting actual bad guys in Afghanistan. You think we can't handle one coward who beats up women and children?" "That's a threat," Derek said quickly. "I can report this." "Report what?" Marcus asked calmly. 5 Marines in dress uniform having a polite conversation with a civilian about documented legal violations? By all means, call the police. Ask them to review Corporal Morrison's file while they're here. Quote. Derek looked around at the 5 men surrounding his truck, finally beginning to understand that his usual tactics of intimidation and manipulation weren't going to work. These weren't people who could be bullied, bribed, or reasoned with using the twisted logic he'd used to control me for years. "I need to get to work," he muttered. "Of course," Marcus said, stepping aside. "But Derek, remember what we discussed. My Marines and I have excellent memories, and we don't forget people who threaten our family." Derek climbed into his truck with shaking hands and drove away without another word. That afternoon, his mother received a similar visit from Jake Morrison and David Chen. His brother got a house call from Tony Reeves and Miguel Santos. By evening, Derek's entire support network had been politely but firmly informed that their campaign of harassment against me was over. But the Marines were just getting started. The next morning, Marcus and Tony Reeves drove to Phoenix to visit our parents. They arrived unannounced at 9 a.m., wearing their dress blues and carrying a folder even thicker than the one they'd shown Derek. My mother opened the door expecting a package delivery and found herself face-to-face with her youngest son, whom she hadn't seen in 2 years. Behind him stood a sergeant who looked like he could bench press a small car. "Hello, Mom," Marcus said quietly. "We need to talk." My father appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to defensiveness as he took in the military uniforms and the formal nature of the visit. "Marcus, what's this about? If you're here about Sarah's situation, we've already explained our position. We don't get involved in marital disputes." "Dad, Sarah was nearly beaten to death by her husband. Your grandchildren watched it happen. That's not a marital dispute. That's a crime. And your response was to abandon her when she needed help most." My mother's face flushed. "That's not fair, Marcus. We offered advice. We suggested counseling. We told her she could move back home if she really wanted to leave Derek." Tony Reeves spoke up, his voice respectfully but firmly correcting her. Ma'am, with respect, your daughter asked for temporary financial assistance to keep her children safe. She asked for a place to stay when her abuser was stalking them. She asked for support during the most dangerous time in a domestic violence victim's life. Your response was to tell her to work things out with the man who'd put her in the hospital. Who are you? My father demanded. Sergeant First Class Antonio Reeves, sir. I've served with your son for 2 years. He's saved my life twice, and I've saved his once. We're family. And that makes Sarah and her children my family, too. Marcus opened the folder he'd been carrying. This contains copies of every text message, every email, and every recorded phone conversation you've had with Sarah since Derek's arrest. It documents every time she asked for help and every time you refused. It also contains the medical reports from her hospital visits, the police reports from Derek's violations, and the psychological evaluation of Emma and Tyler showing the trauma they've experienced. My mother was looking increasingly uncomfortable. What's your point, Marcus? My point is that your daughter and grandchildren needed you, and you failed them completely. But that's not the worst part. Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. The worst part is that you're about to compound that failure by trying to interfere with the help they're finally getting. What do you mean? Dad asked. Tony handed him a second folder. Yesterday, you called Sarah's lawyer and suggested she was overreacting to Derek's behavior. You called the district attorney's office and claimed the charges against Derek were exaggerated. You contacted Sarah's new landlord and implied she was an unstable tenant who might cause problems. My parents' faces went white. They'd been caught actively working against my safety, and they knew it. You're going to stop, Marcus said simply. All of it. The interference, the manipulation, the attempts to undermine Sarah's legal case. You're going to call her lawyer and apologize. You're going to call the DA's office and retract your statements. And you're going to explain to Michelle and James that their little campaign to pressure Sarah into reconciliation ends now. You can't tell us what to do, my father blustered. Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Dad, I've spent the last 1.5 years keeping Marines alive in a war zone. Before that, I spent 4 years learning how to neutralize threats to the people I'm sworn to protect. Sarah and her children are under my protection now. Anyone who threatens them, directly or indirectly, becomes my problem to solve. Are you threatening us? Mom asked. I'm explaining consequences, Marcus replied. You abandoned your daughter when she needed you most. You prioritized your comfort over her safety. You chose Derek's reputation over your grandchildren's welfare. Those choices have consequences. He stood to leave, Tony rising beside him. We'll be in town for 3 more weeks. After that, Sarah's lawyer has my contact information, and I've arranged for continued support from Marine veterans in this area. What happens next depends entirely on the choices you make going forward. As they reached the door, Marcus turned back one final time. Mom, Dad, I love you, but I will never forgive you for this. Sarah needed her family, and you turned your backs on her. Emma and Tyler needed their grandparents, and you chose your own comfort instead. Those children will grow up knowing exactly who was there for them when it mattered and who wasn't. The door closed behind them, leaving my parents to confront the reality of what their choices had cost them. But Marcus and his Marines weren't finished yet. Michelle and James were next on the list, and the lessons they were about to learn would be even more direct. Michelle's perfectly manicured world came crashing down on a Thursday afternoon when Jake Morrison and David Chen appeared at the front door of her $2.3 million Seattle home. She'd been hosting her weekly book club, 12 Affluent Wives Discussing Literature Over Expensive Wine and Artisanal Cheese, when the doorbell rang. Michelle opened the door expecting a delivery, and instead found 2 Marines in dress blues standing on her pristine doorstep. Behind them, she could see her neighbor's curtains twitching as the whole cul-de-sac took notice of the unusual visitors. Michelle Caldwell Pierce? I'm Corporal Jake Morrison, and this is Lance Corporal David Chen. We're here about your sister Sarah. Michelle's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally panic as she realized why Marines were at her door. This isn't a good time, she said quickly, glancing back at her book club guests who were now openly staring through the living room windows. Ma'am, this will only take a few minutes. David Chen said politely. "We can discuss this privately inside, or we can have our conversation right here on your front porch. Your choice." Michelle's social anxiety overrode her desire to avoid the conversation entirely. The last thing she wanted was her neighbors witnessing whatever was about to happen. She reluctantly stepped aside and let them in, but not before announcing loudly to her book club, "Ladies, we'll need to pause for just a moment. Family business." The two Marines followed Michelle into her marble-tiled foyer, their combat boots clicking against the expensive flooring. Jake Morrison carried a tablet and a leather portfolio, while David Chen's hands remained clasped behind his back in a stance that radiated military discipline. "Mrs. Pierce," Jake began, "we understand you've been in contact with your sister's abusive ex-husband regarding her legal case." Michelle's face flushed. "I don't know what Sarah told you, but—" "Sarah didn't tell us anything," David interrupted. "Derek Hoffman's phone records show 3 calls to your number in the past 2 weeks. His text messages, which are now evidence in his criminal case, reference conversations about getting Sarah to see reason and family pressure to drop the charges." Michelle looked toward her living room where her book club friends were pretending to read while obviously listening to every word. "Can we please discuss this somewhere more private?" "Of course," Jake said, following her toward the kitchen. "But, just so we're clear, this conversation is being recorded for legal purposes. Your cooperation in an ongoing criminal investigation is appreciated." In the kitchen, Michelle tried to regain her composure and take control of the situation. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just show up at my home and—" "Ma'am," David Chen said quietly, opening his tablet to display a series of text message screenshots. "On June 8th, you sent Sarah a message saying maybe Derek would get help if you showed some willingness to forgive. On June 12th, you told her that pressing charges makes the whole family look vindictive. On June 15th, you suggested she was, quote, being dramatic about what sounds like a normal marital argument." Michelle stared at the messages, her face growing paler with each quote. Those were private conversations between sisters. "You can't!" "Mrs. Pierce," Jake interrupted, "your sister's ex-husband fractured her jaw and left bruises on her 6-year-old son. The medical reports and photographs are part of the public record now. There's nothing, quote, normal or dramatic about child abuse and domestic violence." "I was trying to help," Michelle protested weakly. David Chen leaned forward slightly. "Help who, exactly? Because according to the phone records, you've been in regular contact with Derek's family members, discussing strategies to pressure Sarah into dropping the charges. That's not helping your sister. That's helping her abuser escape consequences." Jake opened his portfolio and placed several documents on Michelle's granite countertop. "These are copies of the financial records you requested from us when Sarah first asked for help. You claimed your family was, quote, financially stretched and couldn't assist with temporary housing or basic living expenses." Michelle glanced at the papers nervously. "We do have financial commitments. Your Instagram account shows $47,000 in vacation expenses to Europe last month," David said matter-of-factly. "Your husband's LinkedIn profile mentions a $250,000 bonus from his investment firm. Your mortgage records show you pay more for this house each month than Sarah needed to keep herself and her children safe for an entire year." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of muffled conversation from the living room, where Michelle's book club was undoubtedly discussing the drama unfolding in their host's home. "What do you want from me?" Michelle finally asked. Jake Morrison leaned against her kitchen island, his posture casual but his eyes serious. "Mrs. Pierce, I grew up in foster care. Bounced between 12 different homes before I aged out of the system. You know why? Because every adult who was supposed to protect me found excuses not to get involved. Too complicated, they said. Not our responsibility. Someone else will handle it." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "Your sister didn't need complicated help. She needed $3,000 to keep the lights on and rent paid while she escaped an abuser. She needed a safe place for her kids to sleep while she rebuilt her life. She needed her family to believe her when she said she was in danger." Michelle looked uncomfortable. "It's not that simple. Gary has strong feelings about family loans, and we couldn't." "Ma'am, with respect," David Chen interrupted. Your husband spends more on golf club memberships than your sister needed to survive. This wasn't about money. This was about not wanting to be inconvenienced by someone else's crisis. Jake pulled out his phone and showed Michelle a photo. This is Emma, your 8-year-old niece, at her first therapy session. She's coloring a picture of her family. Want to know who she included in the picture? Michelle glanced at the photo and immediately looked away. She drew herself, Tyler, her mom, and her uncle Marcus. No grandparents, no aunts, no cousins. When the therapist asked about extended family, Emma said, "They don't want to help us anymore." That's what your financial concerns cost you, Mrs. Pierce. Your relationship with your sister's children. Michelle's eyes filled with tears, but Jake wasn't finished. Tyler wet the bed for 6 weeks because he was afraid Derek would come back and hurt his mom again. He asked Sarah why nobody wanted to help them, why Grandma and Grandpa didn't love them anymore. Sarah had to explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes adults make selfish choices. David Chen opened another folder. These are the psychological evaluation reports for both children. Emma has developed anxiety that manifests as perfectionist behavior. She's terrified of making mistakes because she associates conflict with violence. Tyler has regressed developmentally and requires ongoing therapy to address trauma responses. I didn't know, Michelle whispered. You didn't want to know, David corrected firmly. Sarah tried to tell you. She sent you photos of her injuries. She explained that Derek was escalating. She begged you for temporary help. Your response was to suggest she was exaggerating and to pressure her to reconcile with her abuser. Jake closed his portfolio and prepared to leave. Here's what happens next, Mrs. Pierce. You're going to call your sister and apologize. Not a fake apology where you blame circumstances or make excuses. A real apology where you acknowledge that you failed her when she needed you most. And then? Michelle asked quietly. Then you're going to make a substantial donation to the local domestic violence shelter in Sarah's name. You're going to volunteer there for at least 6 months to understand what women in your sister's situation go through every day. And you're going to explain to your daughters that their aunt is a hero for protecting her children, not a troublemaker for refusing to accept abuse. David Chen stood as well. Most importantly, you're going to stop all contact with Derek Hoffman and his family. Any attempt to interfere with Sarah's legal case or pressure her to reconcile will be reported to the district attorney as witness intimidation. As they walked toward the front door, Michelle followed them, clearly shaken. What about Marcus? Is he angry with me? Jake paused at the door. Ma'am, your brother spent 18 months in Afghanistan watching Marines die for their brothers. He understands loyalty, sacrifice, and what it means to protect family. Right now, he's trying to process how his own flesh and blood could abandon his sister and her children when they needed help most. Will he forgive me? Michelle asked. David Chen looked back at her with something that might have been pity. Mrs. Pierce, forgiveness isn't something you can ask for. It's something you earn through changed behavior and genuine remorse. Your brother will be watching to see if you're capable of either. They left Michelle standing in her foyer as her book club friends pretended not to stare through the windows. The Marine's next stop was Denver, where James was about to discover that his attempts to stay neutral in his sister's crisis had consequences he'd never considered. James Caldwell worked as a senior software engineer for a prestigious tech company, the kind of place where reputation and professional image meant everything. He prided himself on being logical, analytical, and above the emotional drama that seemed to plague other families. When Jake Morrison and Miguel Santos appeared in his office lobby that Friday afternoon, his first thought was that there had been some mistake. James Caldwell? I'm Corporal Morrison, and this is Private First Class Santos. We're here regarding your sister Sarah's situation. James felt every eye in the open concept office turn toward them. His co-workers had never seen Marines in dress uniform before, and the formal nature of the visit immediately signaled that something serious was happening. Gentlemen, I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for... Mr. Caldwell, Miguel Santos interrupted politely. We can have this conversation here or we can step outside. But we're going to have this conversation. James glanced around at his curious colleagues and made a quick decision. Conference room 3 is available. We can talk there. The conference room had glass walls, meaning their conversation would be visible if not audible to the entire office. James closed the door and turned to face the two Marines, his anxiety evident despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. If this is about Sarah's situation with Derek, I've already explained to my family that I can't get involved in... Mr. Caldwell, Jake interrupted. Your sister was hospitalized with a fractured jaw and bruised ribs. Your nephew was shaken so violently by his father that he had nightmares for weeks. Your niece developed anxiety severe enough to require professional therapy. That's not a situation, that's a crime. James shifted uncomfortably. I understand it's serious, but getting involved in domestic violence cases is complicated. There are legal ramifications, potential safety issues. Miguel Santos, despite being the youngest member of Marcus's squad, had seen enough combat to understand cowardice in all its forms. Sir, what safety issues were you worried about? Derek Hoffman lives 800 miles away from you. It's not just physical safety, James said defensively. There are professional considerations, potential liability if I got involved and something went wrong. Professional considerations? Jake's voice carried a note of disbelief. Your sister asked you for a temporary loan to keep her children safe, and you were worried about your professional reputation? James's face flushed. That's oversimplifying a complex situation. Miguel pulled out a tablet and began reading from it. June 3rd, you told Sarah that helping her, quote, could set a dangerous precedent for family financial expectations. June 7th, you said that, quote, enabling her to stay in a confrontational situation wasn't in her best interest. June 10th, you suggested she should consider the impact on the whole family's reputation. Those conversations were private, James protested. Sir, nothing is private when it involves the safety of children, Jake said firmly. Your sister wasn't asking you to solve her problems permanently. She was asking for temporary help during the most dangerous time in a domestic violence victim's life, the period immediately after leaving an abuser. Miguel showed James his tablet screen, which displayed a series of statistics. 75% of domestic violence homicides occur after the victim has left the relationship. Your sister was statistically in the most danger she'd ever been in, and your response was to worry about family reputation and financial precedents. James looked out through the glass walls at his coworkers, who were obviously fascinated by the presence of Marines in their workplace. Look, I feel bad about what happened, but I can't change the past. What do you want from me now? Quote, Jake Morrison leaned forward across the conference table. Mr. Caldwell, I joined the Marines because my little sister was killed by her boyfriend when I was in college. She called me 2 weeks before it happened, asking for help leaving him. I told her I was too busy with finals to get involved in relationship drama. The conference room fell silent. James stared at Jake, clearly not having expected such a personal revelation. I live with that choice every day, Jake continued. I tell myself I couldn't have known how dangerous the situation was, that I was just a college kid who didn't understand domestic violence. But the truth is, I was more concerned about my own convenience than my sister's safety. Miguel Santos nodded. That's why we're here, sir. To make sure you understand the choice you made and its consequences. What consequences? James asked nervously. Jake opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. These are copies of every communication you've had with Derek Hoffman's family members over the past month. Phone records, text messages, and email threads where you discuss strategies to convince Sarah to be reasonable about the charges. James's face went white. How did you... Sir, Derek's phone and computer were seized as evidence in his criminal case. Every communication he had with anyone regarding Sarah or the children is now part of the legal record. That includes the conversations he had with you about family pressure and getting everyone on the same page. Miguel pulled out another document. This is a formal complaint, filed with the district attorney's office, identifying you as a potential witness intimidation co-conspirator. Your attempts to coordinate with Derek's family to pressure Sarah into dropping charges constitute interference in a criminal investigation. I never meant, James started. Sir, Jake interrupted, what you meant doesn't matter. What matters is what you did, and what you did was abandon your sister when she needed help, then actively work against her safety when she found help elsewhere. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with the Marines methodically documenting James's failures and explaining the legal and personal consequences of his choices. By the time they left, James understood that his attempts to stay neutral had actually made him complicit in Derek's efforts to escape accountability. But the Marines' work was just beginning. There was still one more family member who needed to understand the new reality. And Aunt Carol in Nashville was about to receive a visit that would shatter her comfortable illusions about family loyalty. Aunt Carol had always prided herself on being the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and maintained relationships through difficult times. When Tony Reeves and Miguel Santos knocked on her Nashville door that Saturday morning, she was preparing for her church's annual charity fundraiser, an event where she served as coordinator and took great satisfaction in organizing community support for worthy causes. Carol Patterson, we're here about your niece Sarah Hoffman and the situation with her family. Carol recognized the military bearing immediately and felt a flutter of anxiety. She'd heard through the family network that Marcus was stirring up trouble with his Marine friends, but she'd assumed it was exaggerated gossip. Oh, you must be some of Marcus's friends. Please, come in. I was just about to leave for church, but I suppose we should talk. Tony Reeves stepped into Carol's immaculately decorated living room, taking note of the expensive furniture and religious artwork that filled every surface. Miguel Santos carried a briefcase that looked ominous in the genteel southern setting. Mrs. Patterson, we understand you've been in communication with other family members about pressuring Sarah to reconcile with her abuser. Carol's hand flew to her chest in a gesture of shocked innocence. Oh my, that's not how I'd characterize it at all. I've been trying to help heal the family during this difficult time. Miguel opened his briefcase and pulled out a recording device. Ma'am, with your permission, we'd like to record this conversation for legal purposes. Legal purposes? Carol's voice rose an octave. I don't understand why this would be a legal matter. Tony activated the recorder and placed it on Carol's coffee table between them. Mrs. Patterson, you've been in contact with Derek Hoffman's mother and sister over the past 3 weeks. You've participated in conference calls with other family members discussing ways to convince Sarah to drop the criminal charges. That constitutes conspiracy to interfere with a criminal investigation. Carol sank into her favorite armchair, the color draining from her face. I was trying to bring the family together. Sarah is being so stubborn about all this, and Derek's family is suffering too. Ma'am, Miguel said quietly, Derek Hoffman put your niece in the hospital and terrorized your great-nephew and great-niece. His family's suffering doesn't compare to what he did to children. Carol waved her hand dismissively. Children are resilient. They'll forget about this unpleasantness if the adults handle it properly. But if Sarah insists on dragging everyone through courts and police investigations, it will traumatize them much more. Tony Reeves had grown up in Brooklyn housing projects, where domestic violence was common and often ignored by adults who should have protected children. Carol's privileged dismissal of childhood trauma hit him like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson, he said, his voice deadly calm, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Tyler Hoffman, your 6-year-old great-nephew, now flinches when adult men raise their voices. He wet the bed for 2 months because he was afraid his father would come back and hurt his mother. He asks his mom every night if the bad man is coming back. Carol shifted uncomfortably but maintained her defensive posture. Children pick up on adult anxiety. If Sarah would calm down and handle this more quietly. Emma Hoffman, Miguel interrupted, your 8-year-old great-niece has developed anxiety severe enough to require therapy. She has nightmares about her father hurting her mother. She told her therapist that she tries to be perfect all the time because she's afraid that if she makes mistakes, Daddy will come back and hurt Mommy again. That's unfortunate, but children adapt. Tony leaned forward, his patience finally exhausted. Mrs. Patterson, those children will carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. Emma may struggle with relationships and trust issues well into adulthood. Tyler may develop anxiety disorders or behavioral problems that follow him through school and beyond. This isn't something they'll forget or get over. This is permanent damage caused by a man who chose violence over self-control. Carol's facade of religious concern was beginning to crack. Well, Derek made mistakes, but he's not a monster. People can change if given the chance. Miguel pulled out a thick file from his briefcase. Ma'am, these are Derek's employment records for the past 5 years. He's been fired from 3 jobs for aggressive behavior toward coworkers. He has 2 previous arrests for bar fights. His first wife filed a restraining order against him in 2018 that documented a pattern of escalating violence. Carol stared at the documents as if they were contaminated. I didn't know about any of that. You didn't want to know, Tony corrected. Sarah tried to tell everyone in the family about Derek's behavior for months before the incident that led to his arrest. She mentioned his anger issues, his drinking, his increasingly controlling behavior. The entire family dismissed her concerns as, quote, marital problems. Miguel opened another section of the file. Here are the medical records from Sarah's previous hospital visits over the past 2 years. 3 trips to the emergency room for accidents, a broken wrist from falling downstairs, concussion from walking into a door, and bruised ribs from slipping in the shower. The attending physicians noted that the injury patterns were consistent with domestic violence, that Sarah denied abuse each time. Carol looked genuinely shocked for the first time. Sarah never told us she was going to the hospital. Because she knew what the family's response would be, Tony said bluntly. Denial, minimization, and pressure to keep quiet for the sake of family harmony. Derek had already convinced her that no one would believe her or help her if she told the truth. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Carol's antique grandfather clock. Through the window, they could see neighbors walking to various churches, dressed in their Sunday best for worship services focused on love, compassion, and protecting the vulnerable. Miguel spoke quietly. Mrs. Patterson, you organize charity drives for homeless shelters. You coordinate food banks for hungry families. You pride yourself on helping people in need. But when your own flesh and blood needed help, you chose to side with her abuser. That's not true, Carol protested weakly. I offered advice. I suggested she try harder to work things out. Tony pulled out his phone and played a recorded conversation. Carol's voice came through clearly. Sarah needs to think about forgiveness and healing instead of revenge and punishment. Derek made a mistake, but destroying his life won't help anyone. Carol's face flushed with embarrassment at hearing her own words played back. I was trying to offer Christian guidance about forgiveness. Quote, Ma'am, Miguel said, forgiveness is something that comes after safety, after accountability, and after genuine repentance. Derek hasn't shown remorse for his actions. He's been stalking Sarah and the children, violating court orders, and coordinating with family members to pressure her into dropping charges. That's not repentance. That's continued abuse. Tony opened his own folder and placed a series of photographs on Carol's coffee table. These are pictures of Emma and Tyler from their therapy sessions. Notice how they position themselves in chairs. Always near exits. Always where they can see who's coming and going. That's trauma response behavior. Notice how Emma holds her mother's hand in every photo. She's afraid to let go because she thinks something bad will happen if she's not protecting her mother. Carol looked at the photos and finally began to cry. Not the performative tears she'd used to manipulate family discussions, but genuine grief as she realized the depth of damage that had been done to children she claimed to love. What can I do? She whispered. How can I fix this? Miguel packed up his files and prepared to leave. Mrs. Patterson, you can start by calling Derek's family and withdrawing from their campaign to pressure Sarah. You can call the district attorney's office and retract any statements you made minimizing Derek's actions. And you can call Sarah and apologize, not for misunderstanding the situation, but for choosing to prioritize Derek's comfort over her safety. Tony stood as well. Most importantly, you can examine why you were so quick to doubt a woman who'd been hospitalized by her husband, and so eager to protect a man who terrorized children. Because until you understand why you made those choices, you can't guarantee you won't make them again. As the Marines left Carol's house, she sat alone in her living room, staring at the photographs of traumatized children and listening to the church bells calling people to worship services about love and protection of the innocent. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was thorough. Within a week, Derek Hoffman had accepted Sarah's divorce terms and moved to a different state, understanding that staying in town meant facing ongoing scrutiny from combat veterans who had nothing but time and determination. His family's harassment stopped completely after they realized their phone calls were being monitored as part of the criminal investigation. My parents drove to my town 2 weeks later, not with demands or conditions, but with genuine apologies and offers of concrete help. They paid for Emma and Tyler's therapy, established college funds for both children, and began the long process of rebuilding relationships they'd nearly destroyed through their selfishness. Michelle liquidated some investments and donated $50,000 to the local domestic violence shelter, then began volunteering there every weekend to understand what women in my situation faced every day. Her book club became a fundraising group for abuse survivors, and she used her social connections to raise awareness about domestic violence in her affluent community. James took a leave of absence from work to spend time with Emma and Tyler, learning to be the uncle he should have been from the beginning. He established a trust fund for their future education and therapy needs, and became a regular donor to organizations supporting domestic violence survivors. Even Aunt Carol transformed her charity work to focus specifically on helping abuse survivors rebuild their lives, using her organizational skills and community connections to create real support networks for women escaping dangerous relationships. But the most important change was in Emma and Tyler. With the threat of their father finally eliminated, and their extended family genuinely committed to their safety and well-being, both children began to heal. Emma's anxiety decreased as she realized that making mistakes didn't bring violence. Tyler stopped having nightmares as he understood that the adults in his life were truly committed to protecting him. Marcus and his Marines returned to active duty with the satisfaction of knowing they'd accomplished their mission completely. They'd eliminated the threat, secured the objective, and ensured long-term safety for the people they'd sworn to protect. More importantly, they taught an entire family what it truly meant to support each other through crisis. 6 months later, when Derek violated his restraining order one final time by attempting to contact Emma through social media, he found himself facing not just criminal charges, but a phone call from Staff Sergeant Marcus Caldwell, asking if he needed a reminder about the consequences of threatening Marines' family members. Derek never contacted us again. As for our family, we learned that blood relation doesn't automatically create loyalty, but commitment and sacrifice do. The Marines who pooled their combat pay to keep us safe became Emma and Tyler's honorary uncles, the ones they write to every week and can't wait to see during leave visits. Marcus taught us that true family means showing up when it's difficult, expensive, or inconvenient. It means protecting people even when they can't protect themselves. And it means that sometimes, the family you choose is more reliable than the family you're born into. When people ask me what I learned from this experience, I tell them that I learned the difference between people who say they love you and people who actually do. Love isn't a feeling. It's a decision to act in someone's best interest, even when it costs you something. And I learned that Marines never leave anyone behind, whether on a battlefield in Afghanistan or in a suburban kitchen where someone needs protection from the monsters they married. The rumble of military vehicles in my cul-de-sac that morning wasn't the sound of trouble arriving. It was the sound of cavalry coming to save the day, led by a little brother who'd grown into the kind of man who keeps his promises and protects his family no matter what it costs. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.